one of the significant events of this week was the visit of Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu to Washington, D.C., and among other things, his appearance before the progressive think tank group Center for American Progress. Here to talk to us about Netanyahu's visit is Rebecca Vilkomerson. Rebecca is executive director of A Jewish Voice for Peace. And Rebecca, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So first of all, let's start out for our listeners who might not know. Could you tell us just a little bit about your organization, Jewish Voice for Peace?
Yeah, Jewish Voice for Peace is a national membership organization inspired by Jewish tradition to work for the full equality, justice, and human rights of all the people of Israel and Palestine. We have about 65 chapters around the country, an advisory board of some of the leading luminaries of our time, like Naomi Klein, Tony Kushner, Eve Ensler, Noam Chomsky. We have a rabbinical council and a youth wing, and I think have grown enormously over the last couple of years in particular, about 200,000 people who are supporting us online.
Well, that's wonderful. And by the way, I'm one of them. You've also lived in Israel yourself with your family, and you've been named one of the 50 most influential Jewish American leaders by The Forward, which was formerly known in my grandfather's day as the Jewish Daily Forward, if I remember correctly. So you guys do a lot of great work. Tell me what your thoughts were about Mr. Netanyahu's visit this week.
Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu clearly came with an agenda. He has really lost ground in terms of his status in the U.S. I think, in particular, I think about what happened last spring, which JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, was also a big part of. There was an effort to skip his speech in Congress, and over 60 members of Congress did skip his speech. And I think that was one of the first times that there's been a real partisan divide in terms of public support of Israel. And as the negotiations around the Iran deal have continued, and the Iran deal did thankfully go through, that was a clear blow to his influence personally, and was an indicator that it's starting to be possible in American politics to break the bipartisan consensus around Israel and to defy AIPAC and the other elements of the lobby that promotes Israel, right or wrong, in this country. So I think it's a delicate moment for him, and of course that's increased by the war on Gaza last year, where almost 2,500 people were killed, including 500 children, and then this newest round of escalated violence, I would say. And of course, people talk about escalated violence. What they really mean is that some Jewish Israelis were also attacked, but of course Palestinians are living under a constant state of violence, and so they're really rising up, perhaps similarly to the way they did in the first Intifada and the second Intifada. And so there's a sense that the status quo can't stand. So I think he was coming looking for validation and to rebuild his relationship with President Obama and with the Democratic Party, and has already asked for an increase in aid. So
And can
$3 billion
I,
a year in aid so far, and looking for $4 billion. And so his visit to CAP was in that context, looking to repair his relationships with the Democratic Party.
and can I add maybe another thought and get your reaction to it? You mentioned the bipartisan consensus in support of a kind of unquestioning support of Israel, but and that is certainly true on a political level. But isn't there also another dimension of it, which says that, for example, that unquestioning support of Israel is according to polls, much less apparent among younger Americans, for example, millennials and so on, that there is growing the sort of hegemony of thought about Israel's actions regarding Gaza, where you mentioned 2,500 people died. I think you meant residents of Gaza in that figure. So isn't there a growing sense that that consensus is crumbling, and that perhaps speaking among other places at a liberal think tank would be a way to hopefully shore that up from his perspective before movements for sanctions or the criticisms of his own leadership become more intense?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly what he was trying to do. And I think he realizes that he's starting to lose, in particular, the progressive or liberal wing of the Democratic Party. And like you said, there is a growing dissent among particularly among the progressive, people who are traditionally progressive, African Americans, women, young people, and so that's the crowd that he's starting to lose. And I think that's exactly. I'm very happy that we were able to make the fact that he came to the Center for American Progress (CAP) as a way to shore up his credentials among progressives. We were really able, I think, to get the message across that that can't happen, that our progressive institutions, and whether you really want to call CAP progressive, but at least liberal democratic institutions can't help a leader like Netanyahu, who really is, I have to say, committing war crimes, give him a platform to help him repair his image among Democrats. And of course, there's a lot about the presidential election, I think, wrapped up in there. But I think we were able to extract a cost and help to push the message, which is a very, very important one, that if you consider yourself progressive, you have to include Palestinian rights in that equation. You can't. There's no Palestine exception anymore.
Right. I think that's very well said. And if we say war crimes, you use the term war crimes, what would you do? What would you say were the crimes in question?
Well, I mean, there's constant violations of human rights happening every day in East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the West Bank. If you think about collective punishment of civilians, which the destruction of homes, the imposition of checkpoints, the inability to have freedom of movement, those sorts of things. But in Gaza specifically, gross attacks on civilians, and the death toll in this case does say it all. That went beyond the bounds of I think what are considered the rules of war.
Well, I think there's considerable evidence to back up what you're saying. And okay, now that we've kind of agreed on what Netanyahu's goal was, Prime Minister Netanyahu's goal was in coming to the States and in speaking at CAP and so on, how do you think he did?
Like I said, I feel really, really good that we were able, and I think that we really picked up on a very strong sense of concern and outrage, honestly, about the fact that an organization like CAP, which again is supposed to be a liberal institution, was offering Netanyahu a way to get his message out and, to sort of whitewash his positions. And the idea that someone like him, who is, racist, warmongering, and putting even the situation with Palestinians aside, is a proponent of every kind of neoconservative value that is supposedly what CAP fights against. It really seemed like a pretty absurd sort of situation. And so what we were able to do was create in the media and at CAP itself, and again, this was a huge coalition effort, not just Jewish Voice for Peace, but to make it very, very clear that it is not possible to host this kind of event and not have people rise up in revolt. So we did a letter with the Arab American Institute, and we got well over 100 progressive organizations and leaders to sign on to a letter saying CAP had made a mistake. In addition, along with the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation, we delivered a petition that over 26,000 people signed, saying that CAP should not be hosting Netanyahu. And of course, at the same time, a number of staffers inside of CAP, in an unprecedented move, presented a letter at an internal staff meeting that was later leaked publicly, that said that they were extremely distressed by this invitation. And you mentioned the generational divide earlier. I think it's very, very interesting that the Netanyahu event was a closed door event. It was by invitation only. My understanding is that it was filled with very strong pro-Israel speakers, and that it was mostly the younger staff and the junior staff who were the ones who objected to this invitation. So, you couldn't see a more stark illustration of that generational divide when you have sort of the old Bachers coming in for this talk, while the younger staffers are staying home in disgust.
We're talking with Rebecca Vilkomerson, Executive Director of Jewish Voice for Peace. And speaking of that divide at the Center for American Progress, I don't know if you saw, Rebecca, but ThinkProgress, which is affiliated with a CAP, published an article yesterday entitled 10 Falsehoods That Netanyahu Told During His Appearance at CAP, which makes the observation in the lead that ThinkProgress is an editorially independent news site affiliated with the Center for American Progress, and says we fact-checked his discussion with Tandon and found a number of false claims. So that just the existence of that article suggests a split within that organization. Is that reflective of a broader split among Democrats, you think?
Yeah, well, first of all, about that article, I mean, it was a very strong article, but I also saw some criticism of it, which I agree with, which is that although it fact checked Netanyahu's lies, and there were really quite a number of blatant lies in his presentation, it did not directly address the fact that the president of CAP, who was interviewing Netanyahu, did not, in fact, ask any particularly tough questions and was a pretty obsequious, for lack of a better word,
Yeah.
interviewer by most accounts. And so I think that the fact that they were able to fact check Netanyahu's statements, but we're not offering a critique of the event as a whole. So I think there is perhaps still some limit to the independence of ThinkProgress as from CAP,
Oh,
just
that's
based on that.
that's
But I
an
do think there is a definite divide among Democrats. I think more and more. Democratic values, the values of the party, and again, certainly, it's not that the Democratic Party has not supported wars around the world, is not racist. I mean, there's a lot of problems with the Democratic Party, but nevertheless, people who are Democrats more generally support equal rights. They more generally are anti-racist. They more generally have concerns for human rights, and these are all sadly values that that Netanyahu completely discounts. And so I think his and not just his, the policies of the Israeli government. I mean, the Israeli government right now is made up of a set of ministers that is frighteningly right wing. And to be honest, I think the next prime minister of Israel may very well be more right wing than Netanyahu. So I don't want to put it all on him as a person. There's a systemic problem of the way that the government of Israel has moved farther and farther and farther to the right in its policies. But all of their policies are ones that are really embraced by Republicans, and so they're really that bipartisan divide. If you take away the money in the equation, is I think a natural thing to have happen.
Now, I suppose one of the things that was that I don't believe the head of CAP asked Prime Minister Netanyahu about were his statements, which he later seemed to retract, but his statement that appeared to be Holocaust revisionism, suggesting that Hitler had no intention of instigating the Holocaust until he was urged to do so by a Palestinian figure. Was that something she should have brought up?
I mean, I think it was that kind of assertion that he made, which was absolutely absurd and ahistorical, and again, just wrong and a lie, and to the point of absurdity. It also still had a political point behind it, one that's quite scary, one that is really about incitement and dehumanization of Palestinians and using the greatest insult you could use, certainly in Israel and in the Jewish community, which is blaming someone for the Holocaust, as a way to really, I think, to enable the kind of mob violence that is happening in Israel. There's been some very, very terrifying incidents of settlers, police, army members, and just people on the street colluding to do these sort of like mob extrajudicial assassinations, essentially. So I certainly think she should have been asking about those sorts of things, and it was very, very lacking. I do want to go back to something I said before. Like I don't want to make it seem as though the this is the Democratic Party is the bastion of human rights and justice around the world. I think it's just a little bit better than the Republican Party. So just to be clear.
And yet, strangely enough, until this visit, Netanyahu seemed to make a point to me of closely aligning himself with the Republican Party. And in fact, if I recall correctly, his U.S. ambassador is a former Republican Party operative.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, like I said, his natural allies are the Republicans, and he all but endorsed Mitt Romney in the last election, if you remember, which is part of what has helped to continue to push a rift between him and President Obama. So absolutely, he was trying to, that those are the people who he depends on in terms of his allyship, and it's also a reflection of what the Israel lobby is in this country, which is always important to remember. There's sort of the mainstream Jewish institutions which push a pro-Israel policies and use accusations of anti-Semitism to suppress any criticism of Israel. But the other very important two legs of that equation are the Christian evangelicals, which numerically certainly dwarf the Jewish institutions that are part of this lobby, who are who are basically pushing a apocalyptic messianic narrative, and that's a big part of their support of Israel. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has been very, very happy to get in bed with these people who are essentially anti-Semitic, based on the narrative that they're pushing. And then, of
Right.
course, there's the military-industrial complex, which makes a lot of money off of U.S. military aid to Israel. So there's those three different elements of it which bring it together, and he and Netanyahu in this visit, I think, was trying to, and again, this is why it was so problematic that Cap invited him, knew that he had started to be placed in this sort of one-party column, and he knows that it's important for Israel to continue to get the level, the unprecedented levels of aid that it does for it to be a bipartisan consensus. And so he was doing something very calculated to try to move the Democratic party, back into his column, and I think that's why people were so disturbed by the invitation.
Yeah, and I do have to say, of the reasons people might have for being outraged at this visit, the fact that he leans heavily Republican is probably morally the least significant, at least in my opinion. But it's really not a matter of partisanship. It's really a matter of what you feel about what's going on there in Israel and Palestine. Well, in
Yeah,
conclusion,
totally agreed. And I'm just, and I, and again, it's. I feel like I'm using the parties as a stand-in for certain political positions, which is probably a overgeneralization. That's correct.
but it's fair to say, I think that still the Jewish population of this country, by and large, is far more liberal than the leadership of some of the major Jewish organizations of this country, don't you?
Polls increasingly show that, within the Jewish community has stayed generally liberal and progressive in its values, in very high percentages, and there's an increasing divide and increasing frustration among Jews generally, and I think that's reflected in the growth of Jewish Voice for Peace, feeling that our institutions do not reflect our views, and so there is an increasing divide there, and a feeling that the emperor has no clothes, that these organizations are claiming to speak for us when they really do not.
Well, where can people go to find more information about Jewish Voice for Peace?
Thank you for asking. They can go to www.jvp.org.
All right. Well, Rebecca Vilkomerson, Executive Director of Jewish Voice for Peace, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.